Truth comes before reconciliation, an exercise in American truth-telling. Abstract. The political is personal, and the personal is political. In this article, the author shares a personal deep dive into family history as a means to reckon with American history. Faced with questions about the future of her grandfather's farm after his death, the author delves into the hyper-local history of Nemaha County, Nebraska, to understand this farmland in its historical and contemporary context. From the Lewis and Clark expedition to the opioid crisis, from the Underground Railroad to Google data farms, the author leaves no stone unturned in her attempts to understand the past and present of the land now resting in her family's hands. In doing so, the author explores sweeping arcs of American history, as well as underlying questions. What does it mean to tell the truth about American history? How does grappling with history help build a better future? The author offers her unique journey into family history as a model for both individual and collective truth-telling in America, and argues that truth-telling is but the first step on a long road to reconciliation. Author bio. The author is a musician and mental health clinician. The author trained in conflict mediation at Corrymeela, Northern Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organization. The author has participated in cross-cultural truth and reconciliation efforts in Colombia, the Balkans, and the United States. The author has continued the family tradition of farming and helps operate a farm in Chicago under the Community Growers Program, an effort to convert vacant city lots into urban agricultural spaces. Introduction. Dedicated to my grandfather, April 5th, 1938 to November 16th, 2024. Quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." End quote. By James Baldwin. I am American on my mother's side. My maternal ancestors arrived from Germany between 1859 and 1905 and settled in southeastern Nebraska, where many remain to this day. My mother grew up splitting her time between her father's farm in Nemaha County and Lincoln, the nearest city. She eventually left Nebraska, and I grew up in a small town in Indiana. However, we returned to visit the family farm countless times during my childhood, and my mother has remained deeply involved in the family's farming. My mother's father, the farmer, passed away in November 2024. In light of his passing, I began grappling with questions. What will happen to his land during my lifetime, and beyond it? My questions about land succession also raise questions about the future of rural America as a whole. My grandfather's farm raises the dual question. How did he acquire this wealth, and what are the macroeconomic forces that might threaten a vibrant future for this land? In this article, I approach these personal questions as an exercise in American truth-telling. In researching the history of my grandfather's farmland, I realized that his land story is a story of America. I also realized my questions about the future of his land raised questions about our future as a country. I'm convinced that the United States has never fully engaged in truth and reconciliation processes for the genocide and dispossession of indigenous peoples, for slavery, or for the enduring infrastructure of white supremacy upon which this country was built. In fact, the very prospect of doing so remains contentious, as seen, for one, in the controversy over school curricula. That need not stop us from seeking out this information for ourselves. Although reconciling with injustice requires collective effort, nothing stops us as individuals from telling our truths. Truth always comes before reconciliation anyway. Footnote 2. I have some experience with post-conflict efforts, having worked in truth and reconciliation projects in the Balkans, Colombia, and Northern Ireland. These experiences inform the truth and reconciliation framework I bring to this research. I dove deep into Nebraska's history and its intersections with my own family history. I focused especially on the history of Nemaha County, where most of my ancestors have lived for the past 6 generations, and where my grandfather's farmland resides. This article is a personal reckoning with family history, but family history is American history. I originally shared this research with my family as I grappled with these questions. I now hope to share this research with a wider audience as an example of American truth-telling, and perhaps as a model for the unfinished business of truth and reconciliation on this land so many of us call home. The more we share our American origin stories truthfully and put our unique pieces of the puzzle together, the clearer the whole picture will become. We must face the unchangeable past. We must change what we can in the present, especially those challenges that threaten our future. Section 1. Early Colonization, 1804 to 1861. The land that became Nemaha County was first Oto land. The Oto tribe originally referred to themselves as the Juweri, and are related culturally and linguistically to the Misuria tribe, who refer to themselves as the Nutachi. The Oto Misuria phrase, Nebraska, meaning water flat, is the origin of the name Nebraska. The word Nemaha comes from the Oto words Nemaha, meaning waters for cultivation. The Lewis and Clark expedition encountered Oto leaders in 1804, when the expedition held a council with Oto and Misuria tribal leaders at a place called Council Bluffs, now Fort Atkinson, Nebraska. This was among the expedition's first encounters with indigenous peoples. Clark later negotiated the Fourth Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1830. This treaty was one of the earliest land dispossessions leading to Nebraska's formation, with Oto tribal leaders ceding ancestral lands to the federal government and beginning decades of forced relocation. Footnote 11. In 1855, the remaining Oto and Misuria were confined to the Big Blue Reservation on the present-day Nebraska-Kansas border, where they were stripped of their right to hunt buffalo. In 1881, the tribe was forcibly relocated to the Red Rock Reservation in Indian Territory, or what is now Oklahoma. Over half of the Oto land in Oklahoma was lost to the allotment process after the 1887 Dawes Act, which also accelerated the rate of Oto children being taken from their families and raised in boarding schools during the Kill the Indian, Save the Man era of colonization against indigenous peoples in America. The 1830 Prairie du Chien Treaty also created the Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation for the families of French fur trappers and area native women from the Oto, Omaha, and Iowa tribes, and the Yankton and Santee bands of Sioux. Most of the tribes in the area were patrilineal and did not recognize the children of European fathers, and mixed families were rejected by white societies. So the tribes requested and negotiated this reservation with the federal government on behalf of these families. From the 1830s onward, white settlement in southeastern Nebraska increased, including illegal encroachment on the half-breed reservation land. By 1854, white settlers illegally squatted on over half of the reservation. The reservation residents petitioned for the communal land to be broken into individual allotments with named land patents to help protect from white incursions. The federal government accepted this petition in 1854, compiled a complete list of mixed-race people who could claim individual allotments on the reservation by 1858, and finalized all claims by 1860. The Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation was the first instance of a reservation being broken into individual allotments, predating the 1887 Dawes Act by decades. However, the trajectory for this little Nemaha reservation was the same as all future reservations whose communal land was broken into individual holdings. White settlers actually became even more emboldened to steal or purchase plots, and they owned most of the allotted land in the half-breed reservation by the 1870s. Many of the mixed-race residents of the reservation left or were kicked off the reservation. Some descendants of the original half-breed reservation families chose to remain on the tract. However, in 1861, the federal government disbanded the reservation. One of the original boundaries of the reservation, Half-Breed Road, still exists, cutting southeast from the town of Auburn. The Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation was home to a local folk hero, Antoine Barada. Barada, born of a French trapper and Omaha mother, was a Paul Bunyan-like figure with legendary strength. For example, he was fabled to rescue people from drowning as they tried to escape slavery by crossing the Missouri River. Many of the local stories about him were collected by the Depression-era Federal Writers Project. Popular opinion in the area is that the town of Barada developed around the fur trading post that Antoine Barada operated. Although some of the stories about Barada are tall tales, it is a historical fact that the Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation was on the route of the Underground Railroad and led to the Mayhew Cabin, also known as John Brown's Cave, near Nebraska City. Whether John Brown actually used the cabin or the cave has been questioned, but the Mayhew Cabin was added to the National Register of Historic Places and the National Park Service Network to Freedom in 2003. Near the Mayhew Cabin is the first African-American church established west of the Missouri River. Footnote 35. In 2013 to 2014, the Mayhew Cabin and accompanying museum experienced severe flooding and erosion. The Mayhew Cabin Foundation could not raise funds for repairs, partially because it ran into underlying problems with Nebraska City infrastructure, which the city refused to fix. In 2020, the foundation sued the city, but the case was dismissed because the Mayhew Cabin Foundation's lawyer could not represent the foundation due to poor health. The Mayhew Cabin Museum remains closed indefinitely. The first black man known to have set foot in Nebraska was York, a man enslaved by William Clark, who was brought to Nebraska in 1804 on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Clark promised York his freedom in exchange for accompanying him on the expedition. However, upon completion of the journey, Clark denied his promise and whipped York into submission repeatedly in what Clark described as a strategy of, quote, severe trouncing, end quote. Even though slavery was never legal in the Nebraska Territory, a number of enslaved people were brought to the state by their masters, and the 1860 census showed 10 to 15 enslaved black people residing in the state. Several early settlements in the Nebraska Territory were founded and funded by children of southern plantation owners who were moving west to seek their own fortunes, usually bringing enslaved people with them. Brownville in Nemaha County is named after its founder, Richard Brown, who relocated to Nebraska from his family's plantation in Tennessee, enslaved people in tow, to start his own town. Nuckolls County is named after Stephen Friel Nuckolls, a southern enslaver who relocated to southeastern Nebraska and founded Nebraska City in 1854, bringing his enslaved people with him. Two of Nuckolls' slaves, Eliza Grayson and a 14-year-old girl known as Celia, managed to escape together in 1858. Nuckolls and a posse of slave catchers followed them and eventually caught up with Eliza in Chicago, but an abolitionist mob managed to break her away and smuggle her to Canada via Lake Michigan. Celia's fate is unknown. Footnote 44. As a current resident of Chicago, I think about this story every time I make the trek to or from Nebraska. I was curious if anyone had ever tried to retrace Eliza and Celia's footsteps, and recently learned that a man named Barry Jurgensen retraced the 500-mile journey in 2016. One of the earliest free black men to reside in southeastern Nebraska was Jeffrey Darrowin, a man born into slavery in Missouri in 1806, who was liberated in 1832 after Iowa fur traders purchased his freedom. He became a translator, linguist, and diplomat in the region, working particularly with the Iowa and Omaha tribes. He was also one of the people residing on the Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation who was denied an allotment because he was born of a white slave master and an enslaved black mother, rather than being mixed race, French, and Native. The first free black woman known to reside in Nebraska was named Sally Bain, who moved to Omaha in 1854. little else is known about her. The earliest recorded settlements of free Black families in Nebraska were in the southeast, specifically in Nemaha County, in Brownville and Auburn, and in Nebraska City. Some Black settlements in Nemaha County were established at the behest of a white settler named Benton Aldrich and his family, who encouraged and assisted some formerly enslaved families to set up homesteads near his own. Footnote 51. Benton Aldrich's wife, Martha Jane, was also one of the few people who provided medical help to families before there was a doctor in the area. Quote, before her own first baby was born, she obtained a book and studied carefully what procedures were necessary at childbirth. At the crucial time, she gave directions to the neighbor who cared for her and her child. Soon she was helping others. Always ready to go afoot, on horseback, or in a lumber wagon, she would help in any type of emergency. Her husband told that his wife had helped at the births of 100 babies, including several sets of twins, and that only one baby failed to live. End quote. However, future Black settlements in Nebraska tended to be farther west, in Custer, Dawson, Harlan, and Cherry counties. In 1870, the Black population in Nebraska was 789, and it climbed to 8,900 by 1890. Note 54. I believe it is important to remember these conversations are not about extinct groups of people who only exist in the past. The Oto people, the families of the Nemaha half-breed reservation, and Black settlers of Nebraska all have living descendants. See the Oto-Missouri tribe website for information about the historical legacies and current-day realities of the Oto-Missouri tribe. See the Great Plains Black History Museum for information about the historical legacies and current-day realities of African Americans in the Great Plains region. When sharing this research into Nemaha County's early history with my family, I learned that multiple other family members were already armchair historians. Some family members could recall the old maps of Nemaha County showing the boundaries of the half-breed reservation. One relative also told a story about how the town of Auburn opened a discussion about whether to rename Half-Breed Road, given the term half-breed had long been considered dehumanizing. However, in this family member's recollection, residents who were the descendants of the original families on the reservation fought for the name to stay the same. The sentiment was that Half-Breed Road was among the last local landmarks to document the existence of the reservation. The descendants wanted to preserve it. My grandparents also shared stories about friends who are the descendants of the Half-Breed Reservation's original residents, both friends from childhood and friends who reside in the area today. One relative excitedly showed me a photo of Antoine Barada that he keeps on his phone. He expressed his interest to learn more about the history of the Underground Railroad in the town of Nemaha. Some houses and buildings from the 1850s and 60s are still standing, and my relative wondered if any of the remaining buildings have any connection to that abolitionist history. My grandparents also reported that descendants of Benton Aldrich, who advocated for Black families to settle in the area after emancipation, remain prominent in Nemaha County to this day. Before he passed away, my grandfather participated in some of these conversations about early Nemaha history. However, in typical style for my grandfather, he preferred to sing the praises of the people descended from these early families, of any ethnicity, who still farm in the area. The last time we rode out into farm country together, he pointed out some of their houses and fields. He recited from memory which plots of land they farmed on, how many hogs they butchered a year, how many bushels of corn to an acre they produced, which families were joined by marriage, which children stayed local and which children went away, and who had purchased new farm equipment recently. Section 2, the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Western Frontier. The Treaty of Prairie du Chien and the dissolution of the Half-Breed Reservation were just two of many dispossessions of indigenous land in the Great Plains that made way for the Homestead Act in 1862. The Homestead Act allowed any U.S. citizen or intended citizen who had not borne arms against the Union to claim 160 acres of federal land for a small filing fee, provided they stayed there for a full 5 years and converted it to farmland. Note 56. This is the historical background to Little House on the Prairie and many other, quote, pioneer narratives of settler colonialism in the region. The Homestead Act was initially open to both white and black people, both men and women, and in 1875 it was opened to indigenous people who renounced their tribal membership. However, many barriers prevented disadvantaged groups, whether formerly enslaved people or poor white sharecroppers, from successfully claiming homesteads. Footnote 58. For people who had recently been considered property, the price of the filing fee was often out of reach, let alone the price of equipment and building materials or any kind of financial safety net in the event of drought, blizzard, or crop failure. Discrimination and illiteracy made loans or other financial backing difficult for non-white people to attain. Sometimes black and indigenous people who did attempt homestead claims were chased off their land by acts of racial terror or racially motivated litigation that called their rightful ownership into question. Many people of all races who attempted to homestead did not make it the full 5 years needed to receive a permanent land patent from the federal government. The failure of the federal government to make good on the promise of 40 acres and a mule as reparations to those formerly enslaved, as well as the failure of the Homestead Act to even the playing field for people in poverty, deepened economic divides of race and class in post-Civil War America. Footnote 59. Despite the great obstacles, some black homesteaders were successful. One of the first successful black homesteaders in Nebraska was a man named Robert Ball Anderson, who was able to amass 2,080 acres of land despite several misfortunes. Fraud by land speculators, mining companies, logging companies, the meat industry, and railroad companies was widespread. Many companies paid the filing fees for phony claimants who agreed to pass the land to the business. Companies would also sweep up plots of land abandoned by homesteaders who failed or were chased off by white mobs during their first 5 years. Some companies would simply bribe bureaucrats at the under-resourced General Land Office and receive titles for homestead land. Federal and state governments also passed legislation independent of the Homestead Act that granted railroad companies large tracts of public land. These various methods resulted in huge tracts of farmland going to industrial giants. Footnote 63. One example of this type of legislation was the 1864 Pacific Railroad Act, which granted 10 alternating sections of land for every mile of track completed and inspected. The land that railroad companies acquired was not just for building railroads. Railroad companies wanted to ensure Western land was successfully converted into commercial farmland, yielding cash crops to transport back east. The railroads wanted booming agriculture industry, with high volumes of commercial agricultural products to transport, not a sprinkling of subsistence homesteaders. So, the companies settled much of their new land with their preferred laborers. The railroad companies spent considerable resources marketing Nebraskan land to citizens of other U.S. states, immigrants in the United States, and potential immigrants from Europe. These efforts eventually won over a large number of European settlers. The railroads spent lavish money on advertising in European newspapers and sent scouting agents to make offers directly to farmers. These agents found considerable demand for these deals on this cheap land, particularly amongst landless peasants who had no hope of acquiring farms in their own home countries. These deals usually involved, quote, splendid inducements, end quote, like long-term credit and low interest rates, encouraging landless and sometimes illiterate European settlers to indebt themselves to American companies in the hope of later owning the land outright. In addition to selling the land to their new recruits, some railroad companies further sweetened the deal by also supplying European migrants with the most advanced equipment to grow commercial crops and raise animals in the region, providing low-interest loans to migrants to build homes or acquire livestock, offering the highest quality educational materials on climate and agricultural practice in the area, and sometimes even offering paid employment with the railroad company during winter months to ensure the financial success of their farms. Despite these advantages, some farmers still did not succeed, going deeper into debt to the companies that recruited them to migrate, failing to secure their land, and creating a tenancy class. By 1880, nearly 20% of Nebraskan settlers were held to the land by tenancy agreement. The railroad companies brought significant numbers of Germans, Czechs, Brits, and Scandinavians to Nebraska. And by 1870, foreign-born adults and their children comprised 54% of the state's population. In southeastern Nebraska, the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Company and Union Pacific were active in this process. The following quote is from the Brownville Democrat newspaper in Brownville, Nemaha County, from July 19, 1872. A large number of emigrants left England recently on the steamer Nestoria, bound for Baltimore. They are exclusively English, and a majority of them are from the farming class, that is to say, farmers, their sons and relatives. Unable to obtain farms or farms large enough in England, they determined to seek them in the New World. The section of the colony which embarked numbered 123 persons. Nearly all the immigrants have made arrangements for the purchase of land, and their lands are as nearly as possible contiguous, and all are situated at Lincoln, the capital of Nebraska, and are intersected by the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, whose agents were in the agricultural districts of England during the winter, talking up the advantages of the central western states. End quote. The National Archives states the following. The Homestead Act, however, proved to be no panacea for poverty. Comparatively few laborers and farmers could afford to build a farm or acquire the necessary tools, seed, and livestock. In the end, most of those who purchased land under the Act came from areas quite close to their new homesteads. Iowans moved to Nebraska, Minnesotans to South Dakota, and so on. Unfortunately, the act was framed so ambiguously that it seemed to invite fraud, and early modifications by Congress only compounded the problem. Most of the land went to speculators, cattle owners, miners, loggers, and railroads. Of some 500 million acres dispersed by the General Land Office between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million acres went to homesteaders. End quote. Industry involvement in colonizing the western frontier hastened European migration and removed public land from the pool available to Black people, poor U.S.-born white people, and after 1875, some indigenous people. Major industries benefited from these new European migrants being grandfathered into homesteader and pioneer narratives. The mythology that these individuals were uniquely rugged, determined, and hardworking, and managed to succeed in their homesteading with no help from anyone, simply by their grit and pioneer spirit. While this may have been true of a minority of families who actually made Homestead Act claims and stuck out their 5 years with no help from the federal government, most of the European farmers brought over by major industries largely adopted this narrative about themselves as well, and were often encouraged to do so by local, national, and private media. National mythologizing helped hide the true dynamics of how industry giants profited from gaming the federal system, why they chose to do so, how they succeeded, how European farmers directly benefited from the massive amount of private resources mobilized to help them succeed, and who was most hurt by it. Freed Black people, indigenous people, and impoverished U.S.-born white sharecroppers. Section 3. The Paper Trail. I had long assumed that my family acquired land through the Homestead Act. I now know that there is more to the story. After learning that many European migrants to Nebraska tended to be industry recruits, and that it was more common for Homestead Act claims to come from people already settled in the United States, I began to look into whether I could find a paper trail for how my family acquired land. To this date, I have been unable to locate my family in any of the digitized records of the Homestead Act claims, available through the National Archives, General Land Office, and Ancestry.com. This doesn't mean it's entirely off the table. Nebraska was the first state to fully digitize all of its Homestead Act records, but that doesn't necessarily mean all of those records have made it onto the specific archive websites I've been using, or that I know exactly which search terms will successfully find the records. The best thing to do would be to visit the Homestead Heritage Center in the town of Beatrice, which houses copies of all Nebraska Homestead Act claims and is open to records requests. I did speak with some relatives about my efforts to find a paper trail for how our family acquired land, and together we dug out old documents that they kept on file. We were able to find and connect significant details about the history of the family land this way, and some relatives shared many details from memory. J.H.F. Fred Rogge and Anna Marie Bowling, respectively born in 1835 and 1837, were tenant farmers in Hanover, Germany. They arrived in New York City around 1868 or 1869. They worked as tenant farmhands in Davenport, Iowa, for about a year and a half. They then moved to Brownville, Nebraska, in April of 1870. J.H.F. worked as a bricklayer in Brownville for about 6 months before finding work as a farmhand on a property near Glen Rock, Nebraska. Approximately 3 years after arriving in Nebraska, J.H.F. purchased land of his own in Nemaha County. An obituary for J.H.F. notes that he originally purchased 120 acres close to the town of Rohr at $7 an acre, putting $300 down towards a 20-year lease. Footnote 80. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index Inflation Calculator, as well as a pre-1913 Consumer Price Index Inflation Calculator published by the American Antiquarian Society, a $300 down payment in 1873 would be approximately $8,089 in 2025, and $7 per acre in 1873 would be approximately $188 per acre in 2025. However, in 2025, land in Nemaha County was selling for over $4,000 an acre. He purchased additional land over the years, which he passed on to his children. J.H.F.'s son, William F. Rogge, inherited 160 acres approximately 4 miles west of Auburn. William also purchased additional land, which he passed on to all of his sons, including my great-grandfather, Elmer Rogge. Elmer began his life as a farmer on a plot he inherited southeast of Auburn. Elmer continued the tradition of purchasing additional land, which he passed on to his 3 children, my grandfather and his brother, who have been farming there ever since, and their sister, who moved away but owns and maintains the family farmhouse. My grandfather has not broken the chain. He has also purchased additional land. One of the plots that my grandfather acquired was land from my grandmother's side of the family, which I was able to trace to William Williams, a German immigrant and a hired man on a local farm. In 1866, he went to the train station to pick up the farm's newest hired woman, a fellow German immigrant named Antke Trauernicht. William proposed to her at the train station, and Antke accepted. They were married shortly thereafter. Footnote 81. The large number of single white men settling the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase territory created a, quote, marriage market. This marriage market involved long-distance arranged marriages, mail-order brides, and train station proposals. Women appeared to have a variety of experiences seeking husbands on the frontier, with some experiencing greater economic and social freedom, and others doing so under duress or exploitation. They eventually purchased land in Nemaha County, some of which they passed down to their daughter, Antia Williams, who married Jacob Teton. This land was considered Teton family land, until the Teton family lost the land during the generation of my great-grandfather, Walter Teton. Walter's daughter, my grandmother, grew up as a tenant farmer. Walter was eventually able to buy back some of the original land, which was passed to my grandmother and her 3 siblings. None of her other siblings remained farming in Nemaha County, and my grandfather eventually negotiated a buyout with the other Teton siblings and continued to farm on the land. This is the only land I know of that has been passed down by inheritance and is still in my family's possession. Although other branches of my maternal family arrived during that same period, none passed down land that still resides in my family's hands. It makes sense why I cannot find anyone in the Homestead Act claims. Regardless of whether the land is in the family, if all of the land was purchased, then my ancestors would not be on the Homestead Act records. I have not been able to find who the Rogge and Williams families purchased land from. However, the railroad companies were active in recruiting landless peasants in the specific areas of northern Germany where my family originally lived. I would not be surprised if the railroad companies encouraged some of my ancestors through their advertising efforts in Europe and possibly connected them to the jobs that they found in Nebraska. My best guess is that my ancestors purchased land from railroad companies or individual land speculators who had established ownership over the majority of the land in southeastern Nebraska. In my family's document archive, I found a collection of publications from the Nebraska State Historical Society celebrating the centennial of Nebraska's statehood. In one of the essays, I found the following passage about Nemaha County. Quote, "We refer to homesteaders, but the records in the county clerk's office reveal that only a small part of the county land was acquired through the Homestead Act." End quote. Echoing the data from the National Archives that only 16% of the land dispersed by the General Land Office between 1862 and 1904 actually went to homesteaders. The Centennial Collection goes on to describe other sets of public land that the federal government granted to the newly formed state of Nebraska in addition to the Homestead Act. Around 80% of these public lands ended up in the hands of the railroads too. This Centennial Collection also reported, quote, "Huge tracts of choice agricultural land were in the hands of men whose only purpose was to gamble with the land." End quote. Between 1863 and 1872, there were 10 land speculators in Nebraska who acquired over 20,000 acres, and 18 more who acquired between 8,000 and 20,000 acres each. In my family's archive, I also found a series of articles entitled Reminiscences of Pioneer Days, an oral history collected by the Johnson News between 1934 and 1935 from a man named Fred Kieshel, who was born in 1856 in Alsace and arrived in Nebraska in 1859. Kieshel stated, "Many people of means came from the east and preempted some of the very best of our prairie land, purely for speculative purposes. After they secured their title, they went back from whence they came and awaited the development of the country, which increased the value of their holding without any effort on their part. This class was a detriment to the country and was held in contempt by bona fide homemakers. Most of these never came west again, but sold their land when it had increased in value many times through the sweat and toil of others." End quote. Although I do not have the complete paper trail yet, based on all of the information above, I believe that most likely my ancestors purchased land from companies or land speculators who at the time owned the majority of Nebraska land. I am currently investigating how, if possible, to find records of land sold through the railroad companies, particularly the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Company and Union Pacific, land speculators, or other established farmers at the time. At first, some other family members were surprised to hear everything I'd found about how speculators and industry giants had swept up most of the Homestead Act and other public lands. I was not the only person who had been under the impression that much of Nebraska had been meted out through homesteading claims. Confronted with the numbers about how little land actually went to homesteaders and how much land private industry managed to acquire, one relative quickly asked, "How did they get away with it?" Section 4. The Bell Curve. My ancestors' migration to the United States from Germany between 1859 and 1905 is only the beginning of the story. The details of how land was stolen, negotiated, sold, and bought during the westward expansion are similarly only a part of the story of how people related to that land and each other for generations to come. The land my grandfather possessed is also held in the historical context of what transpired as one century churned into another. Not all the people who migrated after the Civil War to new western states like Nebraska had a comfortable relationship with the American project. Despite the role of big industries in populating the area, southeastern Nebraska became a hotbed for the Farmers Alliance, later the People's Party, in the 1890s. A short-lived but relatively successful insurgent third party that rejected both Southern Democrat agendas and coastal elite Republican agendas. The party organized around agriculture and labor issues articulated in the party's 1890 Ocala demands, which included protections for collective bargaining, regulation of the cropland system, and reclaiming excess lands from railroads and other corporations, among other items. The People's Party held its presidential convention in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892, drawing on its base in western frontier states, as well as burgeoning coalitions with laborers in southern agriculture and northern industry. However, the party's modest successes were short-lived. The party collapsed after its base rallied around Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 presidential election. The party's final death knell was the 1898 massacre and coup d'etat organized by Southern Democrats in Wilmington, North Carolina, to overturn an election won by a multiracial coalition of the People's Party and the Republican Party. Although the death toll is uncertain, it may have exceeded 300 people killed through shooting, lynching, and arson. The party never recovered, locally or nationally. When my relative asked, how did they get away with it? They were asking the right questions. Unfortunately, American white supremacy continued to get away with consolidating political and economic power. The turn of the 20th century ushered in an era of heightened racial violence throughout the country, and Nebraska was no exception. The Great Migration began, and black migrants from the South began finding jobs in Omaha's meatpacking industry. More black families relocated to Omaha, Lincoln, and other large towns in Nebraska during World War I to fill jobs left by soldiers fighting in Europe, often working for much lower wages than their white counterparts had previously. Soldiers returning from World War I to find their jobs filled and wages depressed was one factor that contributed to racial terrorism in the late 1910s and early 1920s. This includes the Red Summer of 1919, when more than a dozen U.S. cities experienced white supremacist massacres, including the well-known Tulsa Race Massacre. Nebraska was no exception. Omaha, Lincoln, Nebraska City, and North Platte were all sites of race riots, lynchings, property destruction, and expulsions of black residents, as well as recent Greek and Japanese migrants. In 1921, the KKK opened its first clavern in Nebraska, located in Omaha, and in subsequent decades, redlining institutionalized racial segregation in Nebraska cities. I could not find a confident death toll from the massacres and race riots during this period, but I did find an estimate of 58 people lynched and 24 legal executions in Nebraska during that time. Footnote 100. The death toll is ongoing. For example, on May 30th, 2020, during the George Floyd protests in Omaha, a white business owner and former Marine named Jacob Gardner fatally shot an unarmed black protester named James Scurlock. The Douglas County attorney originally declined to press charges against Gardner, but Gardner was eventually indicted by a grand jury for manslaughter on September 15, 2020. Gardner died by suicide 5 days later, on September 20th. I could not find any record of lynchings, race riots, or other forms of racial violence in Nemaha County from the 1860s to modern day. I have not found many writings exploring why some places in Nebraska were known for racialized violence and others were not. The history of Nemaha County and the Underground Railroad seemingly supported consistent black settlement in the area during the 1860s, especially in Brownville. This may have set a more live and let live tone for race relations during the subsequent decades of European settlement. Nemaha County also seemingly had no large influx of outsiders after the initial post-Civil War boom. So it may have seen relatively little conflict between groups competing for resources. Instead, the economic realities of rural life may have fostered subsistence relationships that crossed racial lines. Footnote 104, quote, "A second question concerns the interaction between blacks and whites. In Nemaha County, it was the outgrowth of subsistence relationships. These relationships between blacks and whites were critical to black survival in this economically depressed community. These relationships may also have determined black social status and contributed to their sense of security. Can this pattern be discerned in other small communities and rural settings, having both black and white residents?" End quote. While most of my maternal ancestors lived in Nemaha County, the earliest branch lived in Otto County for several years. 5 lynchings occurred in Otto County during this period, including 2 black men who were lynched in 1878 on suspicion of murdering an elderly white couple, and a recently arrived German immigrant who was lynched in 1866 on suspicion of murdering a white child. I take seriously the possibility of my ancestors' involvement in these acts of violence. However, I believe it is unlikely that my family was involved, given that the only recorded incidents in Otto County happened in Nebraska City. According to census records, my ancestors never resided in or particularly close to Nebraska City. These ancestors were German farmers who lived in rural Nebraska since their arrival. Still, the people who were lynched in Otto County are someone's ancestors. The people who committed the lynchings in Otto County are someone's ancestors as well. There is no looking away from this. I consulted the efforts of James Lewin and his colleagues at Tougaloo University in Mississippi to document sundown towns across America. A sundown town was any town that did not allow Black people to be within city limits after dark, whether by formal ordinance or by vigilante enforcement. I found no confirmed sundown towns within Nemaha County. The Black population of Nemaha County has declined but persisted, from its height of 87 individuals in 1880 to 38 in 1970 to 27 in 2000. This is in direct contrast with the neighboring Johnson County, where the Tougaloo map lists the town of Tecumseh as a probable sundown town due to an incident in 1880 when Black families attempting to settle in the area were chased out, an example of homesteaders being displaced by direct racial terror. The town of Tecumseh has not had a single Black resident in any census records for as long as the records exist. Johnson County had a Black population of 4 people in 1900, 0 in 1930, 0 in 1970, and 5 in 2000. According to the Tougaloo map, the nearest location in southeastern Nebraska to surely be a sundown town was Plattsmouth in Cass County. I found a book in my family's document archive which details the history and contemporary features of each county in southeastern Nebraska. The write-up for Nemaha County highlights its history with the Underground Railroad. The authors did not include any of the history of racial terror and sundown ordinances in the write-ups about nearby counties. In this racialized environment, much of the land corporate interests acquired during Reconstruction was passed into the hands of white Americans. By 1910, 94% of farmers who owned their farmland were white. This included my maternal family. The end of World War II also ushered in the golden era of America's middle class. From 1947 to 1974, America built the world's largest and most prosperous middle class. However, this middle class was also disproportionately white. In post-war America, white people's income fell into a bell curve. By 1971, 63% of white families fell into that middle tier of income, 21% below that, and 16% above the middle tier. Other ethnicities did not gain the same prosperity during this time. By 1971, only 46% of Black households fell into the middle tier, with 48% in the lower tier and 5% in the upper tier. The statistics are similar for all other racial minorities. Centuries of systematic oppression and structural white supremacy bore this bitter fruit in the 20th century. Widespread prosperity for white America and widespread marginalization for the other America. Consider the words of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, shortly before his death. At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check. My mother's family entered the middle class during this post-war period. My grandmother grew up without indoor plumbing or electricity. Her mother grew up in a sod house and witnessed malnutrition so severe that people's teeth dissolved like chalk in their mouths. By the 1970s, that same great-grandmother got her first color TV. My family was part of the white middle-class swell of post-war America. They watched the material conditions of their lives change drastically as the seeds their immigrant ancestors planted bore the same fruit articulated above. Section 5. For whom the bell curve tolls. Since the 1970s, the American middle class has been hollowing out. In 1971, the middle class of America held 62% of all household income in the nation. By 2022, the middle class held only 43% of household income, a nearly 20% decrease in middle class wealth. In the meantime, the rich have become richer and the poor have become poorer. While this is not an exclusively rural phenomenon, rural America has witnessed the increasing concentration of wealth in particularly dramatic ways. During the farm crisis of the 1970s and 1980s, fuel shortages, Cold War-era subsidies resulting in low crop prices, high interest rates, and tight credit all battered rural communities. Many families lost their farms to foreclosure, and much of this land then passed into the hands of ever-growing industrial agriculture. By 1977, American farmers had lost $13 billion in revenue, and many could no longer cover the costs of their operation, let alone make a profit. Debt skyrocketed, and then the foreclosures came. Nebraska was no exception. In the 1930s, Nebraska was home to 129,000 farms. But by 1982, that number had dwindled to 60,000. One of my grandfather's friends in nearby Brownville helped organize Tractorcade, a national effort in 1979 to protest conditions in rural America, where 5,000 farmers drove their tractors to Washington, D.C. The protesters were beaten, tear-gassed, and arrested. But some farmers still stayed afterwards to replant the sod on the mall that had been torn up by the tractors. In response to the protest, the Carter administration promised to stop farm foreclosures. But soon after the protesters left, the administration resumed foreclosures on farms with past due loans. Footnote 129. According to Willie Nelson, Tractorcade was what inspired him to begin his annual Farm Aid concert. Apparently, my grandfather's Tractorcade friend became personally acquainted with Willie Nelson and brought him to perform in Brownville. Tractorcade was associated with the American Agriculture Movement, or AAM, an effort to organize farmers into strikes and other forms of collective bargaining under the slogan, "Parity, no charity." The USDA estimates that approximately 1.5 million farmers were involved with the AAM during its peak activity in the 70s and 80s. The AAM held a rally for 6,000 supporters in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1977 and encouraged farmers to bring their tractors, spurring other tractor rallies throughout the United States before Tractorcade. The collective organizing continued into the Reagan administration, with one of the largest protests of farmers in U.S. history occurring in Ames, Iowa in 1985, with over 15,000 farmers gathered. The LA Times reported, "A coalition of farm and rural organizations, ranging from moderate to militant and often unable to agree in the past, joined to call the rally to draw national attention to economic conditions that are driving farmers off the land and threatening many mid-America rural communities with extinction." Bishop Maurice Dingman, the head of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Des Moines and the descendant of a pioneering Iowa farm family, told the crowd, "I come before you today to tell you that, if we do nothing, the bells will have tolled for the end of an American dream." End quote. But none of these efforts were able to stop what came next for rural America. When Dr. King made his 1968 speech on reparations, most agricultural land was still held by individual white families. By 1990, that number had decreased, with small and medium-sized farms accounting for nearly half of all agricultural production in the United States. As of 2022, it was only 19%. As of the 2022 Census of Agriculture, 75% of all farmland in the United States was owned by the largest 9% of operations, with the largest 2% controlling 42% of all farmland. Nationally, the average family farm is less than 500 acres. The average size of the 9% of farms that own 75% of the farmland was over 1,000 acres, with the top 2% averaging above 5,000 acres. The total number of farms in the United States has dropped from over 3 million in the 1960s to 1.88 million in 2024, while the average farm size has steadily increased. Consider the following excerpt from a Nebraska public media article entitled, "Who's Buying Nebraska?" The 9 buyers who spent the most on Nebraska farmland in the past 5 years are all corporate farming operations, real estate developers, or investment firms. The average price of Nebraska farmland has shot up 41% since 2018 to a record $3,835 per acre, according to a UNL annual survey. The buyers of that land, especially the biggest chunks, include multinational corporations, out-of-state corporate farms, and out-of-state investors, according to 5 years of land sales. The Flatwater Free Press spent months analyzing 12,700 sales of Nebraska ag land made in the open market between 2018 and 2022, then navigating a maze of limited liability companies that often hide the actual buyer. Among the findings, the single biggest buyer of ag land by the acre in Nebraska is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church, through a nonprofit tied to a P.O. box in Utah. North Carolina-based Great Plains Farms spent the most money, $65 million on land. Belltown Farms, number 2 in money spent, is an organic farming company with operations in Illinois, Michigan, New York, and Texas. Governor Jim Pillen's company, Platte Center West, was among the top spenders after acquiring hog farms. Some farmland purchased is no longer farmland. The sales show real estate developers buying ag land to build homes and apartments, and companies like Facebook and Google spending millions to build data centers. Oft-rumored foreign buyers like China did not appear in the data, but buyers from Canada and subsidiaries of several multinational corporations, including shipping behemoth Uline, are among the top buyers of Nebraska land. Investor-driven purchases, to some degree, contribute to the overall price increase. Spiraling land prices are, of course, good for sellers, but the reality is that many buyers who can afford to pay the highest farmland prices don't themselves plant soybeans, brand cattle, or harvest corn. In 1982, Nebraska voters passed a law that reined in corporations' ability to own ag land. But in 2007, a federal circuit court struck down that law, known as Initiative 300. Nebraska now has virtually no restrictions on corporate ownership of land, fewer restrictions than the 7 other states that at one point passed an Initiative 300-like law, said Anthony Schutz, a UNL professor specializing in agricultural law. The change in Nebraska's farmland ownership structure, experts say, can have a long-lasting impact on the environment, food production, local economies, and the lives and livelihoods of rural residents. End quote. The biggest buyers have driven up the price of land in Nebraska so high that most ordinary people have been priced out and have no choice but to sell to wealthy investors. In Nemaha County, the median price per acre is $4,861. This is still a lower price than many other locations, but I cannot help but recall my ancestor, J.H.F. Rogge, purchased Nemaha land in 1873 for $7 an acre, which would translate to $188 an acre in modern currency, a price 26 times lower than the actual modern price. What's true of Nebraska is true across the country. Most of the land that was subsidized into the hands of individual white families from the 1860s to the 1960s has since been consolidated into larger and larger operations owned by fewer and fewer hands. Numerous groups are suffering because of this, and there is not even a whiff of a Farmers Alliance or a People's Party, nor a 21st century tractorcade to represent the voices and the interests of all the people getting the short end of the stick. Sociologist William Heffernan noted, quote, "Historically, farming communities were models of rural economic health, and mining communities like those in the Appalachians were an indicator of a crippling system of centralization. Today, farming and mining communities are indistinguishable." End quote. A person might reasonably ask, are people suffering just because the land ownership is different? And if so, how? Put simply, consolidation within the agriculture industry has hurt many rural people's ability to thrive. The loss of family farms causes ripple effects in local economies, as well as the very social fabric of rural communities. Vertical integration in the ag industry consolidates wealth and extracts that wealth away from local economies, which has a compounding impact on daily life. The tax base decreases, threatening funding to public schools, which fuels further depopulation and job losses in education, healthcare, and small businesses. The hollowing out of rural America has caused far too many rural areas and small towns to become, quote, abandoned, economically shattered places with growing social and health problems, end quote. While social ties are often a source of resilience in rural areas and small towns, large-scale economic forces often damage the social fabric of communities beyond any easy repair. More than lost family farms have deeply scarred rural communities. Changing agriculture-related industries like meatpacking have also caused harm. While difficult, those jobs once provided a decent living to many in small towns and rural communities. Many of those jobs no longer look anything like they used to and have been replaced with poverty wages and questionable labor practices. Consider one example of a man named Roland Jarvis from Olwine, Iowa. In 1992, Iowa Ham, a small old canning and packaging company, was bought by Gillette. Overnight, the union was dismantled, and the wages fell from $18 an hour to $6.20 an hour. For Jarvis, who now had the first of his 4 children, it became more important than ever to work harder and longer in order to make ends meet. His meth habit increased along with the purity of the dope. And then one day he did the math. He was making $50 every 8 hours to do a job in which there was a 36% rate of injury, thereby making meatpacking the most dangerous vocation in the country. For this, Jarvis, now that he worked for Gillette, got no medical coverage for himself or his children, no promise of workers' compensation should he be hurt, and no hope of advancement. With Iowa Ham, every employee had not only gotten benefits, they'd owned stock in the company. End quote. Roland Jarvis is one of many rural people who faced these realities in the late 20th century. These farm crises and economic consolidations occurred around the same time or shortly prior to the bottoming out of the industrial core of the North, forming what we now call the Rust Belt. For displaced farmers and agricultural workers, there was no guarantee of finding another blue-collar career and being absorbed into a different workforce. This resulted in more destruction as economic crises spiraled into social crises and vice versa. And no social crisis is more associated with rural America than meth. The rise of meth in rural America is intimately tied to its economic downfall. As rural and small-town residents lost the economic footing they once had from family farms and union jobs, many of these workers began relying on meth to work longer hours for less pay. Consider the story of Lori Arnold, one of the dealers who helped build a meth empire in the Midwest. In 1987, the year that Cargill cut wages at its Ottumwa meatpacking plant from $18 an hour to $6.50 an hour with no benefits, Lori Arnold sold a pound of pure uncut crank for $32,000. The broad sweep of the meth story is as follows. 1. Meth was invented as a pharmaceutical by a Japanese chemist in 1898. 2. Meth was used extensively by all sides during World War II. 3. Meth was legally prescribed in the United States through the 1970s and became especially popular amongst agricultural workers. 4. Laws changed to make meth illegal, and people who were hooked started making their own in-home meth labs. Some biker gangs got involved, but it was mostly small-time dealing. This meth is called P2P meth. 5. Organized crime caught wind and wanted in, including Mexican cartels. Production ramped up considerably in the 1990s and early 2000s. Most of this meth from super labs was ephedrine meth, a different variety than the P2P kind found in home labs. For the first time in history, large swaths of rural America were labeled high-intensity drug trafficking areas. 6. Meth addiction went unchecked as corporate interests lobbied against attempts to regulate pseudoephedrine, and the war on drugs favored incarceration rather than treatment. 7. Rural communities were already reeling from meth by the time opioids ramped up. 8. Meth use looked like it was receding, but since 2013 has rebounded with a vengeance. This is in no small part due to superlabs figuring out how to make an extra potent and refined version of P2P meth that has taken the nation by storm. An unintended consequence of marijuana legalization in much of the United States was that many Mexican marijuana growers switched to producing this new concentrated P2P meth. Meth overdoses in the United States reached a historic peak in 2022. 9. In recent years, many more people are suffering from both meth and opioid addictions at the same time, and increasingly more meth is laced with fentanyl. Sam Quinones, a journalist who frequently covers meth, wrote in a 2021 article, quote, "You don't typically overdose and die on meth, you decay," end quote. The gradual decay from meth is devastating and contributes significantly to homelessness and incarceration in rural communities, and the severity of damage is only increasing. Older versions of meth tended to damage people gradually, over years. With the rise of P2P meth from cartel superlabs, that damage has accelerated, especially to the brain. Quinones writes, "Methamphetamine damages the brain no matter how it is derived, but new P2P meth seems to create a higher order of cerebral catastrophe." According to relatives, law enforcement has labeled one of the highways just 4 miles west of my family's farmland as a major artery for meth trafficking. Statewide, seizures of meth increased 293% between 2018 and 2022. Law enforcement across southeastern Nebraska has continued to report staggering numbers of drug confiscations so far in 2025. Some family members have reported profound sadness from witnessing the power of organized crime grow within small towns in the area. In July 2025, one of the most wanted kingpins of the El Salvadorian cartel MS-13 was arrested near Omaha. Federal officials have since revealed that he and other high-level MS-13 members had been living in the southeastern Nebraska region for the last few years. MS-13 is not alone. The Midwestern High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Task Force has identified over 1,000 drug trafficking organizations operating in the region. Not long after meth, opioids made their way into rural and small-town communities in 2 ways: through prescription opioids and organized crime. Prescribed opioids had no shortage of patients who needed inexpensive solutions for their pain, especially in occupations like farming and meatpacking that carry high risks of injury. Additionally, organized crime began to pump opioids into pre-existing meth distribution networks that were built in rural America. Nationally, opioid overdose deaths were 10 times higher in 2023 than they were in 1999. Between 2018 and 2022 alone, the rate of overdoses rose more than 60%, largely due to fentanyl. Mercifully, opioid overdose deaths have been decreasing in the last few years since their historic peak in 2022. But the fact remains that over 806,000 Americans have died of opioid overdoses since 1999. The result of these spiraling and compounding crises has been a series of negative outcomes for rural and small-town America. 1. population loss. Metropolitan areas make up 36% of all counties, but accounted for 99% of population growth and job growth from 2008 to 2017. During this same period, 71% of metropolitan counties grew in population, whereas over half of small town and rural counties did not grow or shrank. 2. Rural blight. Due to population and economic loss, rural areas are often resource-starved and struggle to maintain public transportation, public works, housing, commercial bases, and education, leading to blight. Substance use and overdoses. Rate of substance use overall are similar between urban and rural settings, but the severity of outcomes is different. For example, while rates of using any substance, including alcohol and marijuana, are roughly equal between urban and rural youth are 35 times more likely to use opioids than their urban counterparts. Additionally, per capita overdose rate can be higher in rural areas than urban ones. 4. Suicides. Rates of completed suicide are 55% higher in rural settings than in urban ones. This is largely due to limited access to mental health services, high levels of substance use, and greater access to firearms. 6. Poor health outcomes and early death. Rural areas experience higher rates of chronic disease, less access to healthy food, lowered life expectancies, worse maternal and infant health outcomes, and a lack of access to healthcare services. Additionally, it is primarily rural conservative states whose state legislatures refused to expand Medicaid access after the passage of the Affordable Care Act. 7. Social and political abandonment. The proliferation of rural sacrifice zones has not been accompanied by broader political or social attempts to provide for the well-being of communities undergoing massive economic restructuring. Many rural and small-town residents struggle with feelings of abandonment and despair and perceive little hope for reviving a place they may have once known as vibrant. 7. Violence and crime. The average murder rate is 40% higher in the 25 states that voted for Trump in 2020 compared to those that voted for Biden. Most of the states with the top 10 highest per capita murder rates are largely conservative and rural. This is contrary to the media narrative that more urban Democratic-run states are ground zero of violent crime. Another consequence of the meth and opioid crises for rural and small-town America has been mass incarceration. Consider the rates of incarceration per 100,000 people in the following states: Louisiana, 1,067. Kentucky, 889. Tennessee, 817. Texas, 751. Indiana, 721. Nebraska, 591. California, 494. Illinois, 433. New York, 317. New Jersey, 270. This is just a sampling, but across the board, more rural and conservative states have significantly higher rates of incarceration than their urban and liberal counterparts. Incarceration has largely been the catch-all societal answer to compounding issues like drugs, poverty, violence, lack of opportunity, lack of resources, homelessness, and the unraveling social fabric throughout rural and small-town America. On average, 11,000 people are incarcerated in Nebraska at any given time, and an average of 30,000 individuals are incarcerated over the course of any given year. In 2019, a total of 69,208 releases were tallied from Nebraska prisons and jails, highlighting the constant cycling in and out that many people experience when struggling with the issues discussed above. National conversations regarding mass incarceration tend to focus on racial demographics rather than the divide between urban and rural areas. As such, instances of rural mass incarceration tend to be left out of the conversation, but there is always more to the story as to how race, class, and geography interact with each other. Urban states tend to have lower overall rates of incarceration, but higher racial disparities, sometimes significantly so. Rural states with higher overall incarceration rates still have racial disparities, but not at the same levels. Consider the black and white incarceration rates in the following states. In New Jersey, the black incarceration rate is 11.9 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 54% white. The prison population is 22% white. The jail population is 25% white. The state population is 13% black. The prison population is 61% black. The jail population is 47% black. For New York, the rate of incarceration per 100,000 people is 317. The black incarceration rate is 7.5 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 55% white. The prison population is 23% white. The jail population is 35% white. The state population is 14% black. The prison population is 49% black. The jail population is 46% black. In Illinois, the incarceration rate per 100,000 people is 433. The black incarceration rate is 7.5 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 60% white. The prison population is 31% white. The jail population is 34% white. The state population is 14% black. The prison population is 53% black. The jail population is 51% black. In these states, the general population is majority white, but the incarcerated population is majority black. In New York's case, which doesn't have a true majority of any incarcerated race, black people are the single largest cohort, and the incarcerated population is majority non-white. In these states, black people are incarcerated at 7.5 to 11.9 times higher rates than white people. Compare the previous data with the following. Kentucky has the incarceration rate per 100,000 people of 889. The black incarceration rate is 2.9 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 84% white. The prison population is 76% white. The jail population is 79% white. The state population is 8% black. The prison population is 21% black. The jail population is 18% black. For Tennessee, the incarceration rate per 100,000 people is 817. The black incarceration rate is 3.4 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 73% white. The prison population is 55% white. The jail population is 66% white. The state population is 16% black. The prison population is 42% black. The jail population is 32% black. For Indiana, the incarceration rate per 100,000 people is 721. The black incarceration rate is 4.4 times higher than the white incarceration rate. The state population is 78% white. The prison population is 58% white. The jail population is 77% white. The state population is 9% black. The prison population is 31% black. The jail population is 18% black. In these states, the total population is majority white. The incarcerated population is majority white. And the white incarceration rates are higher. However, the black population is still incarcerated at 2.9 to 4.4 times higher rates than the white population. I interpret this data to mean that while many rural states have higher incarceration rates in general and show disproportionate incarceration of black people, they also have both majority white populations and majority white prison populations. This is compared to more urban states whose prison populations are majority black, despite the general population still being majority white. Still, regardless of the state's general population demographics, black people are still incarcerated at rates more than double the white incarceration rates. But Nebraska is an outlier in a few respects. For example, Nebraska has a higher rate of incarceration, 591 per 100,000 people, than most urban states. And the majority of the prison population is still white, as is the majority of the general population. However, the Black minority is still incarcerated at 9.1 times the rate of the white population, a rate that is on par with the urban states mentioned above. Native people in Nebraska are incarcerated at an even greater disproportionality, 11.8 times the rate of white people. Nebraska seems to distinguish itself amongst the trends outlined above. A high rate of incarceration, on par with other rural states, massive racial disparities on par with urban states, and a majority base of white people experiencing mass incarceration, also typical of more rural states. Section 6. Bearing Witness. This is the history of rural America that younger generations have to tell. What is recounted just above is the chapter of history that is ours to witness. It's not that the older generations are unaware or unaffected, but the younger generations are closer to what is unfolding. It's my classmate's uncle who died in a meth lab explosion, where all that was left of him were his teeth. It's my best friend's cousin who was killed by police while unarmed and struggling with substance use. It's my old sweetheart's mom who cycles between jail and homelessness. These are snapshots from today. Each generation in my family has borne witness to its chapter of rural and small-town history. It would be impossible to relate the whole context of all the family stories, even my own. However, while conducting this research, I have been struck by the snapshots of history contained in my family's personal memories in Nebraska, as well as my own upbringing in Indiana. I recently made an offhand quip about how many stories from my 22 years living in southern Indiana are disturbing compared to older generation stories of rural life. I joked that my stories would not exactly make it onto Prairie Home Companion. However, my family reminded me that contrasting my stories with my elders' stories in this fashion may be an unfair comparison. My grandparents' memories begin with the Great Depression and World War II. Every generation has seen its fair share of trouble and hardship, and the cozier stories that get passed down to grandchildren are never the full picture. It can be tempting to romanticize the past and sensationalize the present. Even while trying to avoid such pitfalls, I feel safe to say that the different generations of my family have borne witness to different arcs in the history of rural and small-town America. My grandfather rode a pony to school every day. My grandmother taught in a one-room country schoolhouse. You could buy meth in my high school cafeteria. Much has changed. It can be uncomfortable to realize that individual memories, while never the full picture, are connected to broader strokes of history. And it can be even more uncomfortable to speak about it. During her childhood, my grandmother received mail from a family member who was deployed fighting Nazi Germany. During my years living in Indiana, one of my friends was kidnapped by a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang whose membership is sustained in part by mass incarceration. These two contrasting memories are not random nor coincidental. Both are snapshots of much larger events that my family has run into, perhaps without even realizing the bigger picture at the time. Sometimes telling these stories helps us to articulate how our own lives are tethered, even for brief moments, to much bigger things unfolding. My grandmother grew up without indoor plumbing or electricity, and her family kept a root cellar for preserves and pickles. During my childhood, a local meth cook killed 2 people and kept their dismembered bodies in pickling barrels behind his trailer. There are broad sociological reasons why we end up with these snapshots, and sometimes it is a relief to realize that these personal memories bear witness to things much bigger than ourselves. I have personally witnessed 3 shootings in my lifetime. In the past 5 years, 6 people in my life have been shot. I've never been involved in any kind of lifestyle that some people might assume is the explanation for such exposure to gun violence. My high school friend, Emma, was recently killed when her father shot her entire family one by one, execution style, then turned the gun on himself. There was a lot of pain and many instances of hurt people hurting people in rural and small-town America. My memories are not just random aberrations or individual bad luck. They are part of the story of what has gone on in rural and small-town America during my lifetime, in the same way that my grandparents' stories provide first-hand details about the historical realities of their childhoods. There's a rhyme and a reason as to why we end up carrying the stories that we carry. The reader of this article is just getting snapshots, not the full story of any family member's life, not the full story of my life, nor the full story of any of the locations where we grew up. But when we put some of these snapshots of our lives together, we can see the trends. Whether we are aware of it or not, we have witnessed history unfolding in our lifetimes. Bringing these stories forth, even if they are difficult, is an important part of reckoning with what is going on. When I was 19 years old, I had two friends, Andrew and Sarah. They were a white couple, about my age, and living on the streets near where I stayed. I didn't have housing to offer them, but we spent time whenever we could. Sometimes I'd bring food. Sometimes they insisted on sharing their food, if they had some. Sometimes I'd give them rides. Sometimes we'd just hang out. Much of their time was spent looking for jobs and trying to not get beat up by the cops who were escalating violence towards the growing homeless population in town. One day, Sarah called me in a panic. Andrew had been arrested on suspicion of stealing a cell phone when they found a small amount of meth on him. I went to put money on his jail books so he could buy socks. It was February, and the jails were freezing. They don't give anyone socks, underwear, or anything else besides the basic one-ply jumpsuit. You have to buy everything else from commissary. I could cover socks, underwear, and toothpaste, but we couldn't make the $2,000 bail. Then Andrew disappeared. Sarah couldn't find him. Staff at the jail just said he wasn't there anymore. They claimed he wasn't in their system and refused to say anything else. His cell phone was still confiscated. He simply disappeared. Sarah was distraught. We looked all over town. We never found him. During this research, I came across a detailed investigative report by the Indy Star about death and disappearance in Indiana County jails, published in 2021. Indiana does not have a public agency that tracks the number of people who die in its county jails, but the results of the Indy Star investigation found, given what it was able to find from news accounts, obituaries, and submitting open records requests to sheriffs and coroners' offices, Indiana has one of the deadliest jail systems in the country. Mental health crises, drugs, and poverty land tens of thousands of people in pretrial detention. Hundreds die, and the state doesn't keep count. We never found Andrew, but the Indy Star might have. I'm not sure I'd call that closure, but I would call it a revelation. Finally understanding that one individual memory may be connected to something bigger. My own stories are from southern Indiana, but there are similar heartbreaking stories from southeastern Nebraska, from my generation. Take the example of Brandon Tina, a white, impoverished, queer, gender nonconforming individual. In 1993, at the age of 21, he was raped, beaten, and murdered when two men discovered that he had been born female and was passing as a man. The killers also murdered two other witnesses at the scene, one of whom was a black man named Philip Devine. The triple murder occurred in Humboldt, Richard County, roughly 20 minutes from my family's farmland. One of the two murderers, John Lauder, is on death row at the Tecumseh State Penitentiary. My family frequently drives past the prison. Initial news reports portrayed Brandon as a lesbian, trying to live as a man due to homophobia. Still, others have argued that details shared by people closest to him suggest that Brandon was likely transgender and simply didn't get the chance to live long enough to ever claim those words for himself. Speaking openly about poverty, despair, and violence may make rural and small-town America seem like an irredeemable hellscape where nothing good ever happens. But the broad strokes of history are made up of many ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives, even within extraordinary circumstances. The troubles facing rural and small-town America are no different. Ordinary people live through these things in remote areas of the country and still find reasons to love, live for, and fight to protect. My own family has chosen to continue farming in Nemaha County for 6 generations. Trout still needs to be caught in the Nemaha River. Bittersweet still needs to be plucked from the side of the road to decorate the kitchen table. Babies still need to be born. Corn still needs to be harvested. These are still real communities and real lives. The story of rural and small-town America is also a story of love and dedication to place. Many rural people care deeply about where they live, despite the compounding misfortunes that have beset many areas. Despite the love, the social fabric in rural and small-town America has been fraying, and in some cases tearing violently. My own stories are just snapshots, but they are an earnest attempt to point to these tears. Looking these troubles squarely in the eye raises difficult questions about rural futures. What happens next to the people, the communities, and the land? Is it possible to make a decent life in hard-hit rural areas anymore? Is it viable to imagine another 6 generations of my family continuing in Nemaha County? Several factors contribute to toxic stress and community trauma in rural settings. From chronic population loss, lack of economic mobility, climate change-related disasters, mass incarceration, and the erosion of social safety nets, rural America faces tough realities in the present and uncertainty about the future. Anyone who is fighting for the well-being of the land and thus fighting for rural futures cannot ignore what has happened here. The future of my grandfather's land is held in the context of a disintegrating social fabric. The land's future is wrapped in a quilt that has been battered, worn, and ripped. Many individual lives and stories bear witness to this suffering. Section 7 of Mennonites and Migration. A person might reasonably ask, if rural and small-town America are suffering so much, then who are all these factory farms, meatpacking plants, and agribusinesses employing these days? By and large, there are fewer U.S.-born crop workers and more migrant laborers are coming, mostly from Latin America. Against the backdrop of corporate consolidation, slashed wages and benefits, and NAFTA, the labor force of rural America began to drastically change its composition in the 21st century. A government study found that 40% of agricultural workers and 25% of all meatpacking workers in the United States were here illegally in 2001. Many were paid illegally low wages. The practice soon became rubber-stamped after a series of court cases failed to hold corporations accountable in any way other than with slap-on-the-wrist fines. Consider one such seminal case in 2001. Quote, a failed 2001 federal criminal case brought against a Tyson plant in Shelbyville, Tennessee, made clear that corporations would essentially not be held liable for employing or recruiting illegal immigrants to work in the plants, despite the fact that 2 Shelbyville managers were caught on tape by federal investigators asking human traffickers for 500 undocumented workers over 4 months. Tyson's defense team successfully maintained that it's too difficult for Tyson employees to determine who's who among legal and illegal employees. The ruling institutionalized the notion that employers of immigrants are not beholden to offering the same rights to workers that other companies must, for the simple reason that they don't know and don't need to know who works for them. End quote. 2 decades later, the pattern has only become more entrenched. As one sociologist noticed, quote, cracking down on illegal immigration would cripple the food production system, end quote. Human rights abuses are rampant, from human trafficking to wage theft. Lest we be tempted to think that only undocumented people face such abuses, let us remember people can be in the country legally and still be exploited. It happens all the time. For example, there is an upsurge in child labor in the United States, particularly amongst children seeking asylum. Under federal law, these children may pursue their asylum cases, but child labor statutes still prohibit companies from hiring them. NBC News recently conducted a year-long investigation into child labor in American slaughterhouses and found the number of children being illegally employed in the U.S. has increased by 88% since 2019. The U.S. Department of Labor estimated in 2023 that around 6,000 children were employed in slaughterhouses through the nation, but the number is likely higher, especially given that 250,000 unaccompanied migrant children have arrived in the U.S. seeking asylum during 2021 and 2022 alone. A series of deaths of children employed in slaughterhouses has recently garnered media attention to the issue. The U.S. Department of Labor tracks the deaths of foreign-born child laborers, but stopped making the data publicly available in 2017 during Trump's first presidency. At the same time, lawmakers in Republican-controlled states have recently introduced laws to scale back or repeal child labor laws. Some people are in the country legally, with permission to work, and are still exploited. The federal government does provide a type of visa for temporary agricultural labor called an H-2A visa. Between 2010 and 2017, the number of immigrants admitted to the United States under the H-2A visa program increased by 196%. The H-2A workforce is 93% male and tends to live in temporary housing provided by the hiring company. Despite legal permission to work, many H-2A workers still experience exploitative conditions such as wage theft, substandard housing, and hazardous conditions. A person's H-2A visa is tied to the specific employer who brought them to work, meaning that H-2A employees are not at liberty to switch employers while in the country. This arrangement makes H-2A employees more vulnerable to exploitation. Whether on a visa or not, this new rural labor force is very different from a labor force that lives permanently in the area, has families, opens business, gets counted in the census, goes to school and church, and gets elected to local government. Rural areas and small towns lose out from the fact that the majority of agricultural laborers are precluded from creating vibrant communities where they work because they remain largely invisible to the rest of American society. These people are profoundly exploited and sharply segregated from local populations. For companies prioritizing cheap labor, the system is working just fine. Not many companies prioritize finding a pathway for workers and the community to truly invest in one another. Footnote 247. This is not a dig at the laborers because it is not a personal flaw. It is also not really a dig at the surrounding local population either, who are not the people deciding whether this migrant labor force stays or goes. I'm commenting on the system. There are some exceptions where migrants are actually beginning to settle. One example is in Fremont, Nebraska, a town of approximately 27,000 people, located 40 minutes from Omaha. Over the course of the last 15 years, Fremont's Latin American population has increased from almost zero to 16% of the local population. Fremont is home to 3 large slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants owned by Costco and other food industry giants, and the newcomers who have settled in Fremont have largely found jobs in these facilities. Many have settled with their families and opened businesses, enrolled in schools, and started churches. In 2010, the City Council passed a resolution requiring anyone who tries to rent within the city limits to sign a declaration that they are legally in the United States. However, the resolution contained no specifics regarding how to show proof or what the penalties are for landlords or renters who refuse to comply, thus rendering it virtually unenforceable. Many locals have welcomed the new arrivals and expressed gratitude that a once declining town has found new life. Footnote 248. Also, while refugees are a unique and often distinct category of immigrants in the United States, Nebraska is one of the states with the highest per capita rate of accepting new refugees. Nebraska accepted an influx of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian refugees in the 1970s and has continued to do so to the present. Lincoln, Nebraska is home to one of the largest enclaves of Yazidi people, a minority persecuted by ISIS. I have relatives in Crete, a town in southeastern Nebraska with a population of approximately 7,000 residents. Over the past 2 decades, the town has become 50% Hispanic and 25% foreign-born. In June 2024, a 70-year-old white man opened fire on his neighbors, who were recent Guatemalan immigrants. The man wounded 7, including 4 children, before killing himself. The man had previously harassed the family, making obscene gestures and yelling at them to go back to where they came from and to speak English. My family responded to the news with compassion and horror, sharing sentiments like, "This is not what America is supposed to be." I suspect that perspective is informed by the fact that no one opened fire on our ancestors when they immigrated here. But places like Fremont and Crete are still the exception to the rule. Most Latin American families settling in Fremont and Crete are Guatemalan asylum seekers who came to the United States with hopes to stay permanently. The migrant agricultural labor force is predominantly Mexican. U.S. asylum courts rarely approve asylum for Mexican nationals, and oftentimes no easy route to permanent legal status exists for them. In 2016, an estimated 60,000 undocumented people lived in Nebraska, accounting for roughly 41% of immigrants in the state. It is unclear how many of these individuals are counted in the official census, but if fully counted, this group would represent 3.1% of the state population. Closer to the family farmland, I have noticed that newcomers around Auburn and Nemaha frequently fall into two camps: a growing presence of Mennonite families and people who have migrated from Latin America. Both groups are more recent additions to the area. Both groups have been received by longer-term locals with a combination of scrutiny and appreciation. Footnote 263. Imagine the controversy that ensued when a Mennonite family purchased the only store in the town of Nemaha and ceased all sales of liquor. Not long after their decision, the building became severely damaged in an accident. The family lacked funds to repair it, and the Nemaha-only stop currently sits empty. However, in Nemaha County, and likely many other rural parts of America, it is clear that everyone is still figuring out how to stitch a cohesive social fabric together from the various backgrounds and stories that people bring to the area. Section 8. Repairing the breach. The strength of the social fabric in southeastern Nebraska is one of my primary concerns for the future of my grandfather's land. I fear that the future of the land will be constrained by the limited people power in the area. When it comes to the challenges that rural America currently faces, I see the need to build collective power that is capable of tackling systemic issues. Individual self-reliance and grit can only get people so far, as much as those qualities are still virtues in many rural contexts. However, some of the psychology that rural America has inherited might be discouraging social outreach and bridge building that could help tackle some of rural America's toughest problems. For example, American national identity values the pioneer and homesteader stories about the country's development. These narratives tend to highlight the personal exceptionalism of white settlers and extol their extraordinary ability to survive seemingly with no help from anyone. I grew up with many of these types of stories and found plenty of examples in the course of this research. Quote 1. The area around Nemaha is mainly agricultural. Much of the prosperity in this fertile valley is the result of the unselfish sacrifices of the pioneers who developed the land and built home on the raw prairie. End quote. Quote number 2. Explorers and trappers who ventured into this area found Nebraska to be unique, diverse, and rather inhospitable. Between drought, floods, hostile Indians, hot summers, and sub-zero winters, it was at best unpredictable. Pioneers who dared to settle on the land had to be strong, resourceful, and more than a little lucky. End quote. Quote number 3. The early settler brought to Nemaha County rich gifts, the qualities of faith, determination, and rugged self-reliance. Far from friends and kinfolks in an empty land they hoped to call home, the pioneers developed a strong sense of neighborliness, and callers were always welcome. End quote. Quote number 4. These early settlers were ingenious, freedom-loving, and equipped with the courage to face the rigors of settling an unknown but promising land. End quote. Right-wing pundit Ann Coulter put it even more bluntly. In July 2025, she posted on X, "We didn't kill enough Indians." Coulter has 2.3 million followers. and the post was viewed 10.7 million times before being partially censored. As it turns out, so much of rural America was not settled by homesteader survivalists who were uniquely rugged, self-reliant individuals. The pioneer narrative of the Western frontier contains some significant mythology. Huge amounts of capital from industrial titans undergirded the process of settling European peasants on the land and ensuring their commercial success. Describing American settler colonialism as unselfish sacrifice in the face of hostile Indians points to some profound mental gymnastics about genocide and ethnic cleansing. People such as my bricklaying, farmhand toiling ancestor J.H.F. Rogge might have been rugged compared to those sitting on Wall Street or in Washington, D.C., but they were not uniquely rugged compared to the Black and Indigenous people whose survival was undermined for the sake of the American colonial project. European settlers after the Civil War received a lot more than just access to land. They were also chosen for success and economically backed by powerful financial interests. This did not translate to prosperity for every white individual, but it was a systemic dynamic of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We do not have to dig deep to find challenges to the pioneer narrative of Western expansion. The information I found about how little land actually went to Homestead Act claimants and how few of those homesteaders lasted the 5 years required to own their land outright was spelled out plainly on the federal government's own national archives. Myths about individual white grit sometimes hide the huge macroeconomic forces that built rural America. Pioneer narratives also may set rural America up for a bootstraps mentality that resists naming systemic problems and hesitates building social movements. But what has happened to rural and small-town America over the past 50 years is no tragic accident. When powerful economic and political interests decide that you are the sacrifice zone, whether that is on account of your race, to claim your homelands, or to discard you when you are no longer needed to make a profit, not everyone can bootstrap their way out. Those who survive often do so through a tremendous amount of community effort as well as individual bravery. So why is there no Farmers Alliance, Tractorcade, People's Party, or any 21st century social movement to represent forward-thinking rural interests and rural people? Against the historical backdrop presented in this article, I ask, who is fighting for rural futures? If rural people by themselves do not have the critical mass to push back, then who are potential allies? Whose problems resemble your own, and whose survival is tied up in yours? What relationships are necessary for rural problems to be solved, particularly without the economic backing of powerful institutions that supported previous generations of white rural and frontier America? The present moment is an opportunity for reconciliation between communities that are all being harmed, but are divided by those in power. Will anyone answer the call to be repairers of the breach? Footnote 278. The phrase, the repairer of the breach, comes from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. It is also the name of a national organization founded in 2015 that recently garnered media attention for protesting cuts to social safety nets in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill. For as much as I have emphasized the favor of powerful players who were invested in the commercial success of agriculture in the American West, daily life for ordinary farmers was not necessarily easy, and rural communities have often been close-knit during hardship. My great-grandfather, Elmer, fell gravely ill during my grandfather's childhood. His grandmother raised him during the first 5 years of his life, as his mother ran the farm. Doctors warned that my great-grandfather would not live long, and so my grandfather's childhood was defined by his preparation to take over the farm by the age of 12. My grandfather used to talk about how, despite their own familial hardships, his mother would feed any migrant worker or hobo who would come to their front door on their way to the nearby railroad tracks. I have since learned about the symbol system used by hobos in the 1930s and 40s, marking fence posts to indicate generous homes or available work, or to warn of dangers. People in rural communities have long relied on one another and have long been intertwined in each other's lives. But as new types of hardship become entrenched in rural America, where are the houses of welcome now? Where are the fence posts marked with the signs of refuge and of kinship? Are we sure we could survive without them? And if there are signs of danger, who is heeding the warning? Section 9. Reading the signs. To heed the warning signs about the well-being of rural America, I believe we must take a closer look at white poverty. White people, as a demographic, are becoming more polarized regarding wealth. The rich are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer, and the middle class is hollowing out. White people, more so than any other demographic, were previously centered in the middle classes, particularly during the golden age of the American middle class from 1947 to 1974. White people are now shifting more dramatically than any other demographic towards the extremes of poor and ultra-rich. However, lumping extreme data points together can still give averages that seem moderate, even though they do not represent the lived experiences of most people in the dataset. Many statistics about average white wealth are really an imaginary middle point between extreme wealth and poverty, a middle point that fewer and fewer people are actually living. For example, one statistic reveals that the average white family has $168,000 higher net worth than the average black family. And yet, somehow, 61% of America lives paycheck to paycheck. How do we reconcile the massive difference in average wealth compared to the rate of people living paycheck to paycheck? U.S. Census data for 2022 contains the following demographic breakdown about the percentage of households, not individuals, that earn over $200,000 a year. 22.8% of Asian households, 12.3% of white households, 6.8% of Hispanic households, 6.1% of black households, and 5.5% of American Indian/Alaska Native households. However, over $200,000 is as high as the U.S. Census data reports. We do not get a breakdown on how much over $200,000 this income bracket goes. We don't get census data about the percentage of people who make over $1 million or over $1 billion. Only 12.3% of white households make over $200,000 a year. But the wealth in the high end of this bracket is enormous and considerably higher than the other racial demographics in this over $200,000 per year bracket. Consider the following realities. The United States has more billionaires than any other nation on earth, with 813 billionaires as of 2024, including 10 who are in the 100+ billion club. Since the mid-1960s, the wealthiest 1% of Americans have doubled their wealth. At the turn of the 21st century, the top 20% of people held 85% of the total wealth in the United States. 2 decades later, in 2023, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned more wealth than 80% of the U.S. population combined. Although some of the ultra-rich are not white, the overwhelming majority are white. So this 12.3% of white people who make over $200,000 a year includes the overwhelming majority of the ultra-rich. And when this cohort is combined with the rest of white people to calculate average wealth, it deceptively brings the average way up. Now consider the other end of the census data, the percentage of households that live off a combined income of less than $35,000 a year. 16% of Asian households, 22% of white households, 23.3% of Hispanic households, 29.9% of American Indian/Alaska Native households, and 33.5% of Black households. These statistics clearly show a disproportionate lack of wealth impacting Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic households. Still, some people would be surprised to learn that there are nearly double the number of white households living with less than $35,000 a year than there are white households living with more than $200,000 a year. Some people might also be surprised to learn the following. In 2016, there was not a single county in the United States where someone working full-time at minimum wage could afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. While more than 19 million American renters are paying more than 30% of their limited incomes on housing, in 2022, just shy of 600,000 people were homeless. 61% of U.S. workers today live paycheck to paycheck, and 40% have no net worth at all. If the income distribution from 1945 to 1974 had remained, the aggregate income of the lowest earners in America would be $50 trillion higher than it was in 2020. The median male worker needed 30 weeks of income in 1985 to pay for housing, healthcare, transportation, and education for his family. By 2018, the same worker would need 53 weeks, more weeks than in an actual year, to cover the same expenses. The official statistic of the federal government is that 11.1% of Americans live in poverty. However, there are some serious problems with how the federal government calculates its official poverty measure, or OPM. The current OPM is an outdated metric that has not been updated since it was first developed in the 1960s to determine which families could benefit from anti-poverty measures. The federal government estimated that a family's budget was roughly 3 times what they spent on food, a measure that was fairly accurate at the time. However, since the 1960s, food prices have risen 4-fold, while the median rent in the United States has risen more than 16-fold. Using a measure that multiplies a family's food budget by 3 will no longer predict whether a family is going to be homeless next month. Researchers have suggested an alternative OPM, although federal policy has not yet changed. This new proposed OPM asks the question, how many individuals and families are unable to afford basic necessities where they live? Using one measure, 140 million Americans would qualify as poor or low income, which is 43% of the population. Of these 140 million, 24 million are Black, 17%. 66 million are white, 47%. And 50 million, 36%, are all other races. Given that the U.S. population is 13% Black and 60% white, Black people are overrepresented while white people are underrepresented amongst the poor. Additionally, the 24 million Black people living below this alternative OPM line make up 59% of the total Black population of the United States, revealing the incredible economic disadvantage placed on this community. The 66 million white people in poverty make up 37% of the total white population, by contrast. However, it is also true that there are over twice as many poor white people as poor Black people, and the white people make up the single largest demographic cohort of the poor. 2 things about white people are being obscured in most of these conversations about wealth that use average data. The extreme accumulation of wealth by one part of white America and the economic downfall of another part of white America. These trends are being obscured in our most commonly used census data. For starters, we don't distinguish between families making $250 million a year from families making $250,000 a year. This hides the ultra-wealthy by making it difficult to see how much wealth has been concentrated in a very small number of people at the top. In any data that breaks people down into racial demographics, the increasingly wealthy and white billionaire class gets averaged in with an increasingly impoverished white working class. The extremes amongst white people are smoothed out. The data shows economic inequality facing Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic communities much more clearly. But this has not translated into political or cultural solutions. Not all poor white people are rural, and not all rural white people are poor, and not all rural people are white, and not all white people are rural. However, there is a connection between race, class, and geography that I think few people take the time to name explicitly. Poor white people are disproportionately concentrated in rural areas and small towns, and their poverty is not a fluke or an accident. By and large, their economic well-being has been sabotaged through the processes creating the sacrifice zone, and little has been offered to them as a solution or path forward. An understanding of white poverty is necessary to comprehend Nebraska's current socioeconomic landscape. The Census Bureau lists the population of Nemaha County as 7,074 people. Around 3,470 live in the town of Auburn. Only 94 are left in the town of Nemaha, including some of my family. The census reported the median income for households in the county was $60,132. The county is 92.4% white and has a 13.8% poverty rate. According to the Economic Policy Institute's family budget calculator, a single adult with no children would require $42,183 a year on average to afford basic necessities in Nemaha County. While the males in Nemaha County earn a median income of $48,750, females have a median income of $31,641. This suggests that the true percentage of poor and low-income families is higher than the federal OPM suggests. Families who cannot afford basic necessities tend to take on mounting debt, put off health care, and minimize transportation costs as survival strategies, all of which are likely to be the case in Nemaha County. Nebraska is ranked 25th in the nation for household income, exactly in the middle. Median household income is $76,376. The state is 76.2% white, 4.62% Black, 12.3% Hispanic, and 1.2% Native American. The official federal data, again, using the outdated OPM, shows 10.9% of the state lives in poverty. I have not given up on the idea of a brighter future for rural America, but we must stop and read the signs. From what I can see, the signs point towards increasing poverty in America, including for the white majority. Reverend Dr. William Barber II, a Black American clergyman and civil rights leader, writes, quote, "Yes, racism persists, making rates of poverty higher in communities of color. But the same lie that blames Black people for their poverty also prevents us from seeing the pain of poor families who have been offered little more than whiteness and angry tweets to sustain them in an economy where the cost of housing, healthcare, education, and transportation have skyrocketed while wages have stagnated for almost all Americans." End quote. Reverend Dr. Barber II also writes, quote, "And this is what you never hear. Most of America's poor are white. I sound the alarm about white poverty because I'm convinced that we can't expose the peculiar exceptionalism of America's poverty without seeing how it impacts the very people that our myths pretend to privilege." End quote. America would not hold the exceptional status as the country with the highest rate of poverty in the global north, were it not for white poverty. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "I fear I am integrating my people into a burning house." End quote. Dr. King feared that by trying to integrate with white society, quote, "we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and the disenfranchised." End quote. I consider his words prophetic. The people who benefit most from exploitation in America do not want us to see that the house is on fire. The height of the flames are hidden, along with the suffering of rural and small-town America. Reverend Dr. Barber II writes, quote, I take on white poverty as a declaration that Black people may have problems, but we are not the problem. Other people face the same struggles we do." End quote. I think I understand Barber's point. The existence and prevalence of white poverty helps combat racist myths that paint people of color as a problem. However, I am cautious about the word same. I don't think that poor and working class people of color and white poor and working class people are experiencing the exact same struggle. When communities of color experience poverty, violence, and mass incarceration, it is often systemically based on skin color. It is racism. Poor white people are not experiencing their struggle because of racism against the color of their skin. But it is also true that the color of their skin has not prevented them from experiencing poverty, violence, and mass incarceration. This is the rural sacrifice zone. It is awkward and hard to talk about, but the fact remains. Rural sacrifice zones exist, and many groups of people are being hurt, including white people. The house is on fire. Who is going to work together to put the fire out? I want to see a loving future for land that has been tended to lovingly for generations. I have recently begun asking my maternal family what they hope to see in Nemaha County in the next 20, 50, 100 years. The hopes that they articulate are smart and caring. Make some of the towns attractive to new industry and small businesses. Keep the farm in the family. Innovate with crops and farming methods. Protect the school system so that families want to live in the area. Find better ways to tackle addiction and poverty. Help arts, culture, and tourism flourish with smart investment. Preserve important landmarks. However, our discussions get stuck when trying to answer who is going to accomplish these goals and how. It's not that I expect my family to have all the solutions, and I don't have any more answers than they do. Thinking about the future of rural America always brings me back to these hard questions. Where is the people power to accomplish these dreams? Are the stories we have inherited about what made rural communities vibrant in the first place no longer serving us? In order to heal and grow, do rural communities and small towns need to build relationships that might go against some of the bootstraps and pioneer narratives about America, including better relationships with some of the communities that have been most harmed in America? If white people lost the powerful financial backing that their settler ancestors once had, and white people lack the community that accompanies many years of experience surviving oppression in America together, to where will rural white Americans turn now that fortunes have changed? Whose fates are intertwined, and whose struggles are most similar? What would need to happen to return vitality and the possibility of communal thriving to rural sacrifice zones? Section 10. Speaking of sacrifice. My family recently told me an interesting piece of local news. Southeastern Nebraska may soon be the site of America's first niobium mine. Niobium has been discovered in Elk Creek, a town in Johnson County, about 30 minutes south and west of Auburn in Nemaha County. Currently, the United States imports niobium, mostly from Brazil, Canada, and China. Niobium is one of a number of rare earth metals that are used in green technologies, such as batteries for electric vehicles and transmitting energy from wind turbines and solar panels into the power grid. Footnote 333. Niobium has also long been used to strengthen steel and is found in products such as oil pipelines and fighter jets. Only one other mine in California currently produces rare earth metals in the United States. Demand for all rare earths, including niobium, is projected to increase, with some estimates indicating that at least 300 more rare earth mines will be needed worldwide to keep up with increasing demand. The company proposing the mine, NioCorp, has been working for 15 years to begin operations. As of September 2025, NioCorp hopes to put out product by 2029 and become North America's first niobium, scandium, and titanium mine and processing facility. Elk Creek, current population 98, could expect an influx of at least 400 workers to begin breaking ground. Local residents have expressed mixed emotions about the project. Some voice concerns over the health hazards of living so close to a mine. Others fret about the mine's impact on already skyrocketing land value in the area and wonder if locals whose land may be bought out from under them will receive a fair deal. However, there are many who express support for the mine's potential to contribute to domestic energy independence. Quote, "I wish it wasn't in my backyard, but it is. Other people sacrificed, and we need to sacrifice too." End quote. Local resident Lavon Heidemann told the New York Times, saying, quote, "I love this country to no end. We have challenges today, and if we can help make it a better place in an environmentally safe way, then hot dog, I want to be a part of that." End quote. I sat at the kitchen table with family and had a discussion that many others in southeastern Nebraska have likely had around theirs. How might this mine transform the region? Is it wrong to hold out hope that this could be a good thing? What will be the cost? And perhaps most importantly, who is going to pay that price? The discovery of niobium in southeastern Nebraska feels like a perfect example of core dynamics frequently at play in rural America. Power structures surrounding access to and control of natural resources, and ordinary people navigating those power structures as best they can in the midst. Many people in rural communities understand that something drastic would need to happen to revitalize the places they call home. But many are also wary of what the process may entail and whether it's going to be the same old story of empty promises all over again. As one relative recently told me, quote, "We remember the way it used to be," end quote. And the memory of all that has come before seems to inspire hope, nostalgia, grief, and anger. Conclusion. We have covered a lot of ground, from the Lewis and Clark expedition to Google data farms. All these facets, from land ownership to immigration, from wealth distribution to rural blight, are signs of continued fault lines in American society. The fate of my grandfather's farm is not a neutral fact, divorced from current American realities. Whatever happens to his land is part of the whole continuing story about what is happening to rural America and America at large. This history we are living is clearly connected to older demons that lurk within our nation's power dynamics. If our family holds on to the land, it will situate us as little guys relative to the macroeconomic forces concentrating extreme wealth in this country. It also continues the entrenched pattern that, whether little guys or big guys, land ownership in this nation is still predominantly white. If my grandfather's land passes to other hands that are accumulating and consolidating wealth, this too is part of American history in the making. The land can only be understood in the context of the rural sacrifice zone, where many groups of people are being harmed simultaneously, and where the viability of a dignified life for generations to come remains uncertain. This is a reckoning. It occurred to me that during the frontier years after the Civil War, so much capital was flowing in a closed system. The family records I found frequently made note that most of our relatives came over with virtually no money or possessions, usually with just a few dollars to their name. The money they earned during their first years in the country was likely paid to them by the companies or individuals who already had a foothold in westward expansion, land speculators and the railroad companies who gamed the system. This money then returned to those exact same pockets when people like my relatives purchased land from them, land that those companies or speculators had gotten for a steal, metaphorically or literally. The $300 that J.H.F. Rogge paid for his farmland was money that he saved up while working as a bricklayer and farmhand. In other words, it was money that likely came from and then returned to the same pool of wealth and power. Once landowners, these impoverished European immigrants began to generate their own wealth and grew into that post-World War II bell-curved white middle class. Much of that land has since been taken back to the same pockets yet again. And the middle class is crumbling, with so much wealth accumulating once again in the hands of very few. This also places the family in an interesting juxtaposition as well. Neither hollowed out, like so many other families who were once middle class, nor part of the new wave of 21st century robber barons who have been concentrating enormous wealth. What does that make us? Accomplices? Survivors? Fossils? A buoy in the storm? Maybe it all depends on what comes next. There are many truths to reconcile, and my lone voice has no unique authority to do that reconciliation. I am not here to tell anyone what to think or feel in response to any of the information collected above. I also don't think we will come to any form of reconciliation alone within our own heads. My way forward through these issues has always been through collective vision and action. We very much need one another, and I mean we in the broadest possible sense. Not just my own family, but every family who has been born into this legacy, impacted by it, and is somehow reckoning with how things have turned out for them in the present day. The hyperspecifics of Nemaha County history reveal broader truths across America. We find not only the infrastructure of white supremacy and colonization, but also how many groups of people have had their fates intertwined. We see how exploitation is excused. We see the many axes of power and how ordinary people have had to navigate those power dynamics. We don't always choose the exact same ways of doing so. Everything gets harder when multiple things are true at once. I do have to agree with James Baldwin, however, in his sentiment that, quote, complexity is our only safety, end quote. Working across social fault lines is very difficult, and I would be naive to pretend otherwise. This is where I lean on the idea that truth comes before reconciliation. I believe that the first step is to tell one another honestly what has been going on in our own communities. The goal of that truth-telling is deeper understanding. But hearing different people's truths is not inherently a roadmap for moving forward. Truth-telling in all its messy complexity rarely provides any easy answers, but it can be the first step towards reconciling injustice. One of my favorite musicians, a singer-songwriter from Chicago named Al Scorch, has a song with the lyric, "True mercy means just meeting the need where the suffering demands." End quote. Truth-telling often brings to light the suffering. Reconciliation means figuring out exactly what this suffering demands, whose mercy must be mobilized, and whose impunity must be stopped. I have my doubts that truth and reconciliation look anything like a breadline. Those with ill-begotten wealth or power are not going to simply hand out what is owed. Any serious dent in inequality will require mobilization and collective power. Not everyone needs to be an expert in the past. Most people just need to bear witness to what they are living in the present. But we may be blindsided by bigger forces if we don't somehow put our different pieces of the story together to see the long arcs of history that hold us. America has no shortage of original sins, but doesn't seem to stop sinning either. As our current Nebraska history shows, we are grappling with violation and woundedness, both new and old. I find it difficult to imagine what collective reckoning with genocide, slavery, and exploitation could look like, knowing that most of the hoarded wealth and profit from white supremacy and colonization is not in the hands of ordinary white people, or even the government. This wealth is in the hands of an increasingly smaller, more powerful, and more global political class. Reverend Dr. William Barber II described an encounter with a UN official tasked with reporting on economic inequality in the U.S., who said, quote, "I'm not religious, but this sounds like a God-sized problem," end quote. The flow of capital has been in the total opposite direction of anything we might consider land back, reparations, or wealth redistribution. Moreover, the culture wars surrounding power and control in America have become even more cynical and violent. This document should bear witness to the fact that this is really nothing new, and people have managed to come out the other side. But we are in a particular moment, in a new cycle of history, and it is unfolding in front of our very eyes. This is as true in Nebraska as it is anywhere else. What could my own deep dive offer as a model for others? What if every family had access to this level of detail about their own American story? What if young people were encouraged to understand the context of wherever they live, and to understand what they are walking into when they walk into their community? What does it mean to commit to truth-telling on an individual and family basis, even though none of us have power by ourselves to reconcile mass injustice? My personal reckoning was sparked by my grandfather's passing and questions of what happens to his farmland after his death. The family land of 6 generations past straddles the old boundary of the Nemaha Half-Breed Reservation, not far from the road that is still named Half-Breed Road. The next 6 generations who may care for that land and community are inheriting some tough realities. Things are constantly changing, and yet, somehow, other things seem to never change. My lone voice will not be able to resolve the way forward for my family any more than the way forward for America. But I know, when in doubt, begin with telling the truth.